The passive voice, a virtual meeting during the peak of a crisis. 3 witnesses are connected over video, each at home with a bookshelf or kitchen cabinet in view. The chairwoman is blunt. "Will you apologize?" she asks witness number 1, a woman in her 70s who seems unsteady with the mute button. Witness number 1 responds, "I'd be happy to apologize to the American people for the pain and tragedy they've suffered." But when pressed about her own part in causing the epidemic, she grows uncertain. She's angry, she says, that employees of her company broke the law. She's angry about events from 2007 and angry about what's happening again in 2020. Yet she can't bring herself to confess her own complicity. Another of the committee members calls that out as the classic passive voice, a subtle trick that implies detachment from the chain of events. Then the committee turns to witness number 2, younger, well-groomed. He echoes his older relative. And again they deny direct responsibility, even as their company has reached a major settlement with the Department of Justice, paying enormous sums without admitting liability for a national crisis. A frustrated committee member asks the third witness, "Doctor, has any executive spent a single day in jail for these corporate misdeeds?" He quietly admits, "I believe not." That's when the politician points out something bigger. What about our own government's role? How it's given license for this brand of corporate impunity? You can see the dynamic. A large corporation has pushed a product so pervasively that thousands, even millions, have been harmed. Yet its executives blame the circumstances, or shift their language into a passive mode, has been associated with, as though the crisis were purely incidental. Meanwhile, a mother in North Carolina writes to the committee, "I lost my child, only 20 years old, and haven't recovered yet. The pain is too intense." The executives offer only clipped apologies. The entire exchange leaves a single phrase echoing, "the passive voice." It's a rhetorical gesture that highlights the gap between how these witnesses see themselves and how the committee and grieving families see them. And it brings to mind questions about the power of seemingly small actions. If one corporation's policies and marketing can trigger a national epidemic, what does that tell us about how social contagions actually work? A few decades ago, a book explored the idea that a small nudge, the slightest push, could tip an entire system. Now, this new conversation, Revenge of the Tipping Point, turns that premise upside down. Sure, a quick push in just the right place can spark a beneficial movement. Cut crime rates, get kids reading, curb smoking. But the same power can be used in malicious ways, causing crisis after crisis. We need to understand who is behind those pushes, which techniques they use, and to what ends. In the coming chapters, we'll follow oddities in a Miami office block, a disastrous executive retreat at a Boston Marriott, a storybook community called Poplar Grove, a cul-de-sac in Palo Alto, each revealing how a handful of individuals can reshape an epidemic. We'll look at Waldorf schools, a low-profile narcotics enforcer named Paul E. Madden, a scandal involving women's rugby at Harvard, and even a 1970s TV miniseries that changed society's memory of an entire historical event. All of these show how clever or unintended interventions can reshape social contagions, deliberately or accidentally, sometimes with the best of motives, and sometimes not. Eventually, we circle back to the chilling story of these 3 witnesses. Why did they incite so much anger? Why did they refuse accountability? And how did a corporation's careful management of small details spiral into a national epidemic? In the end, you might rethink the entire premise that an epidemic is just bad luck. After all, the hearing reminds us how crises emerge from subtle shifts and cunning manipulations. The passive voice we hear repeatedly is a way of washing one's hands of those manipulations. Above all, this hearing is our entry point to a hard truth. Epidemics reflect our shared behavior, our policies, and sometimes our denial. When mistakes come to light, do we own up, or do we talk around it, hoping nobody notices? As we'll discover, if we're willing to face our role in these crises, we might just learn how to tip the odds in favor of genuine solutions, and stop settling for the refrain of "has been associated with." The explosion of bank robbery in Los Angeles in the 1980s and 90s, and why a seemingly identical crime wave skipped other cities altogether. Our journey begins on a day in November of 1983 with a phone call to the FBI's Los Angeles field office. There's a new guy on the scene, the Yankee Bandit, who shows up at one bank after another in a crisp outfit and a southern accent, breezing off with thousands of dollars. That day, he hit 6 different banks in 4 hours, an unbroken world record. His spree is just one thread in a full-blown epidemic. Over a few decades, the FBI's bank robbery squad finds itself nicknaming a parade of robbers: the Mummy Bandit, the Michael Jackson Bandit, the Marx Brothers, even the Village People, each with a signature gimmick. By the early 1990s, Los Angeles is handling as many as 2,600 robberies a year, a shocking outbreak of mayhem that looks very much like a contagious phenomenon. Then into this roiling scene steps a small group of criminals who deliberately scale up the process. One of them is Casper, who orchestrates teams, recruits kids still in their teens, and dispatches them to take over banks by force. It leads to an astonishing 175 robberies in just 4 years, as Casper and his partner watch from afar like Hollywood producers. Eventually, the FBI throws 50 agents on the case, builds enough evidence, and finally puts Casper behind bars, at which point bank robberies in LA drop precipitously by 30% in a year. All of this begs the first puzzle. Why would any city experience such an extraordinary outbreak of a crime as old as the West, while others, such as New York, never catch the same fever? Willie Sutton, the most famous American bank robber of the post-war era, perfected the trade in New York, a city full of would-be imitators. Yet unlike Los Angeles, no epidemic of hold-ups takes hold there. What is different about LA that leads it to a run of thousands of robberies a year, while New York remains relatively unaffected? To unravel this, we turn to the concept of small area variation, developed by physician John Wenberg. He observed that how doctors treat patients and how often patients undergo certain medical procedures varies wildly from one region to the next. It isn't patient demand, but rather local norms or overstories that make place matter so profoundly. Suddenly, the parallel is clear. An epidemic rooted in something invisible but region-specific. In one place, a set of beliefs, a local group of characters, and a certain environment can ignite a bonfire of activity, like the mass spree of bank robberies in Los Angeles. In another place, the same spark just never catches. That's why Willie Sutton's audacious crimes in New York didn't stir a wave of imitators, while LA's particular conditions allowed the Yankee Bandit or the West Hills Crew to become super-spreaders. In each situation, there's no single factor, poverty or unemployment, that easily explains it. Instead, we find an outbreak that respects a distinct regional boundary, much as diseases can flare in one area and skip another entirely. That leaves us with the next step in the puzzle. When a social epidemic breaks out, like bank robberies in LA or vaccine denialism at small private schools, what exactly triggers the localized spread? How do small pockets of professionals, parents, or criminals latch onto a contagious idea, practice, or strategy, then send it roaring through an entire network? That question leads to the second puzzle. Why certain groups, like parents at a Waldorf school, make the same unusual choices, or why one set of doctors prescribes treatments so differently from their peers. Again, place matters, and local norms can go to extremes. By the end of this chapter, we have discovered 2 new truths about social epidemics. First, you can see them unfolding with tremendous force in one spot, but not next door. Second, they usually come down to small pockets, small decisions, and a deeply local overstory. The trouble with Miami. On September 12, 2019, Philip S. Fulmers stands before a federal judge in Miami, convicted of orchestrating one of the biggest Medicare fraud schemes in American history. He pleads for mercy, describing how he has lost over 50 pounds since his incarceration, how he has scarred his children, and how his elderly parents have suffered. He confesses, weeping, that he alone is to blame. A lengthy trial proceeded that day in court. The government investigation into S. Fulmers' sprawling nursing home empire took years, culminating in 8 weeks of testimony about sham invoices, bribery, kickbacks, money laundering, and shady doctors. Associates wearing a wire had captured hours of S. Fulmers' conversations, depicting him as a man who believed ordinary rules did not apply. The trial itself was stacked with Hollywood-esque detail. S. Fulmers was tanned, handsome and profligate. He drove a Ferrari Aperta worth over $1 million, flew on private jets, and lavished money on luxury hotel rooms. He liked to call cash fettuccine. One of his attorneys called him an entire air force of a parent. His elderly father, Morris, was a legendary figure from Chicago who had donated over $100 million to charity and greeted reporters in a purple and gold Lakers outfit with a matching yarmulke. At trial, stories of lavish orgies, trips to Las Vegas, large piles of kickbacks, and a bribery scheme involving a university basketball program all emerged. More than 9,000 pages of transcripts showed testimony from curious witnesses, like the Delgado brothers, who navigated complicated personal dramas while helping Esformes orchestrate hundreds of thousands of dollars in monthly payouts. At one point, the prosecutor focused on a shell company's payments of hundreds of thousands of dollars per month in cash. One witness matter-of-factly explained how every 30 days he would bundle envelopes of money, 50s, 20s, 10s, 5s, all in stacks. The sums ballooned beyond imagination, at times reaching $400,000 a month in kickbacks alone. Yet, in the midst of all that excess, other witnesses painted a portrait of Esformes that suggested he might not be fully rotten. He would visit nursing homes on Saturday nights, checking on patients, inviting basketball star Dwayne Wade for visits, dancing with staff, giving people hugs. His defenders insisted there was genuine kindness in him. The question arose, how did he lose himself so badly? At the sentencing hearing, a long-time family rabbi testified that Esformes had become unrecognizable from the good man he once was. The rabbi referred to Esformes as Philip of Chicago, once known for supporting charitable causes, who transformed into Philip of Miami, seduced by a corrosive environment. Miami, the rabbi insisted, was where the moral downfall began. That notion sets off the idea of small area variation, the way certain communities develop local patterns of behavior that outsiders struggle to explain. In chapters on bank robberies and Waldorf schools, the argument was made that local overstories, narratives high overhead but profoundly influential, set the tone for people's actions in ways that can be dramatic and surprising. From local acceptance of robbery sprees to the skepticism at Waldorf schools towards standard vaccination schedules, there is a consistent pattern. Where you live often dictates how you live. In Esformes' case, investigators soon discovered that Miami played an especially large role in spawning schemes involving Medicare. From bribes to money laundering, Miami's infrastructure for fraud dated back to events in 1980, an influx of drug money, the Mariel boat lift from Cuba, and one of the nation's worst race riots. Those disasters eroded public confidence in institutions and created a culture where bribery and corruption became shamelessly routine. Big bags of cash went in and out of banks. Patient recruiters pitched government-subsidized insurance scams right at bus stops. The city eventually became ground zero for Medicare fraud. Esformes' schemes erupted from that environment. Fraud agents discovered offices that billed millions to Medicare for fictitious services. Buildings with official signs turned out to be shells. One ring, run from a money laundering front just floors above the Federal Strike Force's own offices, laundered huge sums every week. Investigators found nominee owners locked in rooms, signing checks or clinics buzzing homeless people for phony medical procedures. This was the environment that consumed Esformes, whose father had built a formidable elder care operation, but whose son took it to levels of fraud that prosecutors called breathtaking. At trial, witnesses recounted how Esformes' mania for profit was matched only by his paranoia. He allegedly urged associates to flee, undergo plastic surgery, and vanish abroad so they could not testify. He believed in an empty chair defense if they were gone. No one could contradict his version of events. The final twist to the story arrived in December 2020. After Esformes served 5 years, his sentence was commuted by Donald Trump. From the vantage point of the rabbi who had once championed him, it was another turn of fate that made sense only in Miami, a city of blurred lines between big money and big deals. Soon after leaving the White House, Trump moved to Florida as well. Was it just another footnote to the city's saga of easy money and surreal deals, or the final proof that certain places cast powerful spells that draw people in? Perhaps this is how we are to understand the downfall of a man once known for generosity. He simply moved from a safer environment into a wild frontier of moral corrosion. He was Philip of Chicago until he became Philip of Miami, overshadowed by forces both personal and regional. Just as we saw with the bank robberies in Los Angeles, or families opting out of vaccines at Waldorf schools, where you live can shape your actions more profoundly than most of us ever imagine. Poplar Grove. A crisp fall afternoon. A real estate agent named Richard drives slowly through the winding streets of a well-kept town. He's friendly, tall, and seems to know everyone. He points out one house after another, rattling off details about the families inside, how many kids, their ages, and where they work. The people who move here, he says, want security and good neighbours. It's a place that feels close-knit, comfortable, prosperous. He calls the place Poplar Grove, but that isn't the real name. It might remind you of any affluent American town. Single-family homes, manicured yards, safe streets, a downtown with churches in neat rows of red brick. The high school is excellent. Sports teams win championships. Almost every family has children, and they like that their kids can walk the neighborhoods and greet familiar faces. Richard, however, admits something nags at him. All this shared value, this focus on safety, perfect schools, near luxury but not quite, means it's all one kind of person. The community is homogeneous, unified in its priorities, performance, achievement, and sending kids on a path that leads to a bright future. On paper, it's an ideal. Anna Mueller and Seth Abrutin visited, expecting to find just another success story. The two sociologists learned instead that Poplar Grove hides a dark pattern, a cluster of suicides among teenagers. Parents came to Poplar Grove thinking they had found a refuge from the world's ills, yet over time, the pressure on kids to achieve created new problems. Mueller and Abrutin discovered that, despite its outward charm, the uniformity of Poplar Grove bred a dangerous vulnerability. They talked to parents and students. The kids told them about unrelenting stress. Feeling like you must be a high-achieving athlete, artist, or musician, often all at once, was the norm. Adults noticed it too. There were no real off-ramps for teens who couldn't keep up with the intense, winning-at-all-costs mindset. One teenager described a near panic at getting a few Bs because, she believed, that kind of failure would somehow send her spiraling into homelessness. Another insisted he felt a rebellious streak, but still went through rigorous classes and extracurriculars to fit in because being truly different felt impossible. The collegial feeling, as Richard put it, had no tolerance for kids who weren't on board. That uniformity turned lethal. Several teens in the high school died by suicide within a short span, just as a single illness can sweep through a population of animals that lack genetic diversity. A crisis that should have been contained or minimized took hold. Each death seemed to add momentum, as if the community's very sameness enabled the infection of despair to spread more easily. The best parallel comes, strangely enough, from an old controversy in the world of zoos. Decades earlier, zookeepers breeding cheetahs in captivity had little success. A feline coronavirus outbreak wiped out many of their big cats. They discovered that cheetahs had almost no genetic variability, making them tragically vulnerable. Once disease hit a few animals, it would likely ravage them all. The same principle applied in Poplar Grove, total uniformity of ambitions and social rules, with no alternate culture to cushion stress or provide escape. This monoculture problem resonates with the story of Florida panthers too. Generations of inbreeding left those panthers on the brink of extinction until conservationists brought in fresh genes from Texas cougars. The hybrid cats thrived. But Poplar Grove's parents do not want to water down their prized school. They like that everyone's values match. They want the AP classes, the top sports, the safe environment. So they resist change, even as their children succumb to mental health crises one after another. Psychologists and educators label Poplar Grove an example of iatrogenesis, an illness caused by the very people trying to help. In medicine, it happens when a prescribed drug's side effects are worse than the disease. In Poplar Grove, well-meaning parents and educators built a high school designed to churn out excellence. But the side effect, suicide clusters, revealed the risk of forging a monoculture, as if that pursuit of a perfect environment ended by endangering their teens. As the suicides continued, Mueller and Abruten, with all their research, couldn't find an easy fix. Parents kept demanding intense academic options. The principal touted high expectations. The school's website highlighted its consistent, unbending focus on winning achievements from every student. An outside observer, like Richard the real estate agent, saw what many inside refused to confront. He decided not to send his own kids to Poplar Grove schools, choosing the next town over, a place of lesser prestige but broader diversity. He trusted his daughters wouldn't suffer the same suffocating tension that weighed so heavily on Poplar Grove's children. As for Poplar Grove, it proves that a tight, wealthy, seemingly ideal community can incubate a silent epidemic when all paths lead in the same direction and kids can't break free of the expectations. As with captive cheetahs or panthers, a lack of diversity, be it genetic or social, leaves a group fragile in the face of a crisis. Monocultures draw us in with their promise of safety and ease, but as the tragedy in Poplar Grove reveals, they can leave us perilously exposed to the wrong kind of contagion. The Magic Third. A city in California, a place known worldwide for its cutting-edge technology and top-tier universities. Drive a few miles out of the gleaming center, and the streets take on a different look. Small post-war bungalows, tidy lawns, and a cul-de-sac called Lawrence Lane. The homes there date to the 1950s, built when new arrivals from the South were putting down roots in supposedly liberal cities, only to be shunned by white neighbors. This was a moment in American history, marked by white families fleeing the moment a single black household arrived. Researchers called it white flight. Real estate operators referred to tipping a building when a neighborhood's makeup reached an invisible threshold and the exodus began. Social scientists tracked these patterns in cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, and Atlanta. Once a neighborhood's black population exceeded a certain percentage, white families left. The question became, where was that tipping point? Some suggested 5%, or maybe 25% or 30%, above which a white neighborhood became unrecognizable to its longtime residents. A group of civic-minded residents in Palo Alto decided they did not want that chaos of flight and upheaval in their community. They bought a modest plot of land on the outskirts of town and drew up strict rules. This subdivision, called the Lawrence Tract, would divide the lots equally among white, black, and Asian families. No one group would exceed 1/3 of the total population. Neighbors pitched in to maintain the perfect balance. If a white owner sold a house, it had to be sold to another white buyer. If it was a black owner, the buyer needed to be black as well. The guiding logic was to halt any tipping point before it could begin. The first families moved in, determined to demonstrate that people of different races could live as true neighbors. The wives held social gatherings, the husbands went hunting together. They discovered, though, how fragile a social engineering project could be. When one lot changed hands, the homeowners panicked if that sale threatened their carefully calibrated proportions. They even convened a tense meeting where a black family seeking to purchase an extra lot was turned away. For the residents, it was a difficult moral choice. They wanted to protect their long-term vision of racial harmony, but in the process they denied a black buyer who desperately needed housing. Written accounts of this crisis reveal the guilt that the original founders felt. They had started with the best of intentions, but they ended up applying mild discrimination to avoid the vicious kind. In the eyes of outsiders, it looked like they had sacrificed one of their own. Still, they held on to the rule, leaving that lot empty for a decade. They believed anything less would risk tipping the entire street. Sociologists recognize that numbers alone can reshape group dynamics. One study showed that if a single woman joins a predominantly male team, she feels tokenized. 2 women is somewhat better, but 3 is the tipping point. Researchers call it the magic third. As soon as 3 women serve on a corporate board of 9, the culture changes. It is no longer a token presence. Now the group sees multiple women, allowing them to speak as individuals, not mere representatives of their gender. When it came to racial integration in the 1950s, community leaders talked about a threshold of comfort, maybe 5%, maybe as high as 30%. They knew that once neighborhoods moved beyond that range, white flight seemed unstoppable. By consciously capping the proportion of black homeowners at 1/3, the Lawrence Tract wanted to halt any large shift in racial composition. Their hope was to create a stable, integrated micro-neighborhood. Though small in scale, it was an attempt to solve a massive social upheaval by precisely adjusting the numbers. The harsh lesson was that tipping points are temptingly simple in theory, yet they are excruciatingly complex to enforce. To preserve diversity, the tract placed burdens on each individual sale. To forestall one calamity, wholesale flight, they ended up imposing local hardships. A black neighbour, who might have felt safe moving to a diverse street, got shut out when the proportion passed the set limit. That heartbreak left scars. Modern debates echo these same themes. Think of a corporate board deciding how many outsiders to bring on. Think of a school trying to maintain just enough minority enrollment to cultivate true diversity. If a leader has a numeric target that must be met at all costs, there will be moments of tension and awkward enforcement. Hard choices arise whenever we discover that a small shift in numbers can send a system cascading past its tipping point. Critics say it can look cynical to treat people as percentages, yet tipping points can push us toward a different kind of social engineering, done quietly. Often we see institutions nudge the makeup of their group, adjusting who is admitted or hired without publicly acknowledging it. That hush might be an attempt to avoid the discomfort felt by the Lawrence Tract, whose members had to vote on each shift in the balance. The trouble is, secrecy can lead to backlash. Institutions might get caught tinkering behind the scenes, with no clear public rationale. Or, as with that cul-de-sac in Palo Alto, the group might openly debate whether to accept a new neighbour, drawing criticism for micromanaging racial proportions. Every community grapples with questions about who belongs and in what number. The small experiment on Lawrence Lane highlights the tricky moral terrain of orchestrating a neighbourhood's composition. That corner of Palo Alto launched a grand hope of stable diversity and ended up forcing painful decisions. On paper, the group used precise math to avert white flight. In reality, they found that tipping points offered no simple answers. They discovered just how messy it can be to fix a magic number and try to hold people's lives to it, lot by lot, sale by sale. The mysterious case of the Harvard women's rugby team. Harvard's varsity women's rugby team faced Princeton on a solitary athletic field, with few fans and a damp wind sweeping across the grass. Harvard dominated and won by a sizable margin. Beyond the match itself lay a puzzling question. Why did Harvard add varsity women's rugby in 2013, when its campus already offered more sports opportunities than nearly any other university? Harvard admits students through two distinct tracks. The first is for the academically gifted, competing purely on merit. The second is for ALDCs, recruited athletes, legacies, dean's interest list, and children of faculty. ALDCs make up around 30% of Harvard's student body and follow a strikingly different path to acceptance. Court filings revealed that athletes in particular enjoy a substantial advantage. Over 6 years of data, only one athlete qualified as an academic superstar, yet practically every athlete in this category was admitted. The question then becomes, why does Harvard, with thousands of extraordinary applicants from around the world, prioritize recruiting athletes in relatively small or niche sports? During the Students for Fair Admissions (SFFA) lawsuit, Harvard's Dean of Admissions cited community spirit, vibrancy, and personal drive as reasons to give preference to athletes. However, a simpler explanation emerges. Sports provide Harvard with a subtle, unobtrusive tool to shape its student body. The men's squash team, for instance, might recruit internationally, drawing players from places like Tauranga, New Zealand. Similarly, the women's rugby team could scout globally for dedicated recruits from top-tier high schools in the US or abroad. By favoring sports that attract a specific socio-economic profile, Harvard can quietly guide the composition of its campus community. Tracing this practice back nearly a century uncovers its historical roots. In the 1920s, Harvard faced a sharp rise in Jewish enrollment. Alarmed, President Abbott Lawrence Lowell introduced subjective admissions criteria, essays, references, and personality scores to cap Jewish representation below a certain threshold. This marked the beginning of Harvard's ability to manage the demographic makeup of its student body subtly. Although Jewish enrollment quotas faded over time, the apparatus of holistic admissions persisted. Historian Jerome Carabell has documented how Harvard continued to calibrate its demographics with minimal transparency. The contrast with Caltech is striking. Caltech's enrollment of Asian Americans has fluctuated dramatically, climbing as high as 45%, because its admissions emphasize pure academics and ignore legacies or athletic prowess. Meanwhile, Harvard's proportion of Asian Americans has remained stable, or even declined in some years, despite a national surge in academically qualified Asian applicants. This reflects Harvard's deliberate control over group proportions. The creation of the women's rugby team highlights how this aim extends even to less prominent sports. Well-known tools like tennis, rowing, fencing, and sailing have long been used to funnel high school elites onto campus. Rugby adds another avenue for recruiting female athletes, largely from affluent communities or prestigious overseas academies. Each recruit fills a valuable ALDC athlete slot, contributing to Harvard's hidden social engineering. However, this strategy rarely benefits underprivileged groups. Scandals like the one at Georgetown revealed how wealthy families paid bribes to coaches to secure one of these coveted athletic endorsements. Universities frequently defend race-based diversity programs in spirited terms. However, when it comes to athletic favoritism that primarily benefits privileged applicants, the reasoning often centers on vague claims about community or intangible qualities. The reality is that many recruited athletes come from high-income families with the resources to invest in specialized training. Their path to Harvard depends not on raw academic ability, but on skills honed through expensive coaching and travel. The Supreme Court's rejection of race-based affirmative action underscores the inconsistency. Universities argued that race was essential for achieving diversity, yet they resisted defining specific tipping points. Meanwhile, nobody questioned the far clearer and larger boost given to affluent tennis or rugby players. This quiet form of affirmative action fosters a curated diversity tied to well-funded youth sports while excluding equally talented but less privileged students. After the court's ruling, Harvard issued a lofty statement about valuing multiple facets of human experience and keeping doors open to all. The irony is that the same system, which once restricted Jewish applicants, continues to manipulate group proportions through selective sports recruitment. The nearly empty, rain-soaked rugby pitch at Princeton symbolizes a gateway for a select group of students into one of the world's most prestigious universities. Mr. Index and the Marriott outbreak. On February 26, 2020, Biogen held its annual leadership retreat at a Boston hotel near the harbor, gathering 175 people from around the world. The day featured presentations in a grand ballroom, lively conversations over meals, and networking during cocktail receptions. At the time, news of a virus spreading overseas felt distant and unthreatening. But by early the following week, panic set in as Biogen employees returning home began falling ill. Public health authorities scrambled as the company urged staff to avoid Boston's major hospitals to prevent overwhelming emergency rooms. Many attendees had traveled from the Marriott to meet colleagues at other events or flown back to facilities in places like Florida and North Carolina. Soon, emails flew between Biogen teams and state health officials as they realized the outbreak was linked to their conference. Genetic studies later revealed a distinct mutation in the virus, labeled C246T, that could be traced back to the Biogen meeting. This mutation appeared in clusters across multiple states, as well as in far-flung locations like Australia and Slovakia. Investigators estimated that hundreds of thousands of infections originated from this single event. Despite other introductions of COVID-19 into the region, only the Biogen strain exploded into a globally significant outbreak. Epidemiologists struggled to explain why this particular event seeded such widespread transmission, while many other cases fizzled. The Biogen retreat highlights a recurring puzzle about epidemics. One event, sparked by one person, can ignite a massive cascade of infections. The question is, what makes some individuals so potent in spreading a disease that most transmit only moderately? Research in aerosol science offered early clues. Even without obvious coughing or sneezing, speaking produces countless droplets that linger in enclosed spaces like cigarette smoke. If a speaker with a high viral load addressed the Biogen attendees in a stuffy room, it could have created the perfect conditions for mass transmission. But this does not fully explain why certain individuals become super spreaders, releasing 10 or even 100 times more viral particles than others. Scientists suggest factors like saliva consistency, body mass, age, or hydration levels may play a role. Thicker, stickier airway secretions might result in a greater viral output. Studies where participants were deliberately infected with the same virus strain showed that most viral particles in the environment came from a small fraction of individuals. This law of the few pattern holds true for nearly all infectious diseases, where a minority of people drive the majority of transmission. Society often views contagion as a process in which every infected person contributes equally, but events like Biogen's reveal a different reality. A small minority of superspreaders can determine the trajectory of a pandemic. This raises complex ethical and practical questions. If a future virus is more deadly or contagious, could we identify superspreaders and intervene? For example, would society deny entry to theatres or airplanes for those deemed high risk? Such measures could prevent outbreaks but come with significant moral dilemmas. How far should we go to curb transmission? Technological advances might soon allow us to identify superspreaders. Devices that measure exhaled droplets and quick saliva tests to detect thick, high-emission secretions are already under development. These tools could revolutionize outbreak management, but they also present challenges. Would we use this information to target individuals? Past inaction on air pollution from the worst vehicles suggests society might resist similarly targeted interventions for disease control. At the close of the Biogen retreat, employees left the hotel unaware that their gathering would become infamous as a mass-spreading event. In hindsight, a single person with a mutated strain of SARS-CoV-2 had unwittingly triggered ripple effects that would ultimately affect hundreds of thousands worldwide. This event underscores a key truth about epidemics. The majority of cases do not drive the majority of transmission. Instead, a small number of individuals or events can dominate the trajectory of an outbreak. Understanding and addressing this dynamic will be critical when the next pandemic inevitably emerges. The LA Survivors Club. In Los Angeles, a group of Holocaust survivors met by night in a Hollywood high school classroom. Each carried the weight of unimaginable horror: Auschwitz, death marches, the loss of loved ones. They brought artifacts they could not discard but no longer wanted to keep at home. Photographs of vanished mothers, uniforms from concentration camps. Initially, their goal was modest. They sought a closet where these reminders could lie, away from their daily lives. Yet, when they placed a small advertisement to display these fragments of suffering to the public for one Sunday, the response astonished them. Thousands came. It was 1961, over 15 years after the Holocaust ended, yet there was virtually no public commemoration in the United States. No major Holocaust museum existed. In this corner of Los Angeles, these survivors improvised a small gallery, calling it the Martyrs Memorial Museum. It began as one room, supported by a shoestring budget. Over time, as survivors shared their stories, the exhibit outgrew each rented space. Despite limited resources, they persisted, moving and expanding, sparking a broader movement. Holocaust museums, memorials, and resource centers began to emerge across America, in cities like Dallas, Chicago, Miami, and Houston. Their modest museum would eventually settle in a gleaming building in Hollywood's Fairfax district. But why did this commemoration take so long? Why was America's first Holocaust museum not established until 1961, with broader awareness only taking root decades later? Historians offer some clues. In the post-war years, Holocaust survivors carried deep shame of their accents, their tattooed numbers, their lost families. Many avoided discussing the subject publicly. Meanwhile, academic historians and textbooks of the 1950s and 1960s barely mentioned Auschwitz or Dachau. In this era, composer Arnold Schoenberg received more attention in textbooks than the Nazi death camps. The Holocaust was known but rarely spoken of. Silence ran deep. By the 1970s, little had changed. In Germany, soccer fields replaced camp ruins. Even in Israel, the Holocaust's details were more felt than openly examined. In America, the topic remained in the shadows. But then something shifted. A wave of activism emerged, teaching the Holocaust in schools, protesting signs of resurgent anti-Semitism, and fighting to preserve survivors' experiences before time erased them. Grassroots efforts sprang up across the country. This momentum coincided with a pivotal moment in mass media, when three major television networks dominated national attention, capable of shaping public discourse like no other medium. In 1978, NBC aired an ambitious four-night miniseries titled Holocaust, starring Meryl Streep and James Woods. Despite criticism from figures like Elie Wiesel, who called it offensive and cheap, the series captured the nation's attention. For many Americans, it was their first real confrontation with the horrors of the Holocaust. Night after night, half the country tuned in, stunned by depictions of mass shootings and casual cruelty filmed on location at an Austrian camp. The series reached a quarter of West Germany's population when it aired there, provoking guilt, tears, and fierce debate. It marked a dramatic turning point. Where there had once been silence, now there was a public thirst to learn and memorialize. Historically, wars and genocides have followed a pattern of delayed remembrance. After World War I came Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. After Vietnam, films like The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now. But the Holocaust defied this timeline, remaining largely absent from popular culture over 30 years. The breakthrough came with NBC's Holocaust miniseries, which ignited a national conversation and seeded broader public awareness. In Germany, the show reshaped public discourse so profoundly that it helped overturn the statute of limitations on prosecuting war criminals. In America, it aligned with grassroots efforts by survivors like those in Los Angeles who displayed their artifacts and shared their heartbreak. Their work helped establish Holocaust museums in city after city. By the 1990s, these efforts had transformed the cultural landscape, making Holocaust remembrance central to modern moral consciousness. The timing of Holocaust's release was crucial. In 1978, the conditions were ideal for national resonance. This was the paradoxical power of mass media during that era, when primetime programming could genuinely shift public awareness. A single network miniseries, dramatizing a persecuted family's story, allowed half the nation to experience the unthinkable horrors of the Holocaust in real time. The term Holocaust, which carried little weight in the 1960s, became a word of profound significance, shaping collective memory. This story reflects the quiet determination of ordinary people. The founders of the LA Museum could not have foreseen that their small collection would foreshadow a cultural shift. The NBC executives who greenlit Holocaust likely did not anticipate its epic influence. Yet together, their efforts revealed the power of personal artifacts and storytelling to overcome decades of silence, bridging the gap between private suffering and public recognition. This is how a historical overstory is rewritten, through the synergy of survivors willing to speak and an audience suddenly ready to listen, giving the Holocaust the name, space, and prominence it had so long lacked. Doing time on Maple Drive. The world just after the fall of the Berlin Wall witnessed unexpected political transformations sweeping across Eastern Europe. Intellectuals, journalists, and statesmen alike failed to foresee these revolutions, even the heroic dissidents who helped instigate them. This paradox, explored by Timur Kuran in his 1995 essay, The Inevitability of Future Revolutionary Surprises, highlights the phenomenon of profound societal changes arriving seemingly out of nowhere. Kuran cites Václav Havel, future leader of a free Czechoslovakia, who diagnosed the Soviet Empire's fragility, yet missed the revolution he himself predicted. Fast forward to America in the early 2000s, where a similar phenomenon unfolded around gay marriage. Activists worked tirelessly for marriage equality, facing crushing defeats as states passed amendments banning same-sex unions. Allies like Senator Dianne Feinstein warned the movement was moving too much, too fast, too soon. Yet, in little over a decade, public opinion flipped, and gay marriage became the law of the land. This astonishing reversal surprised even those leading the charge. Why do revolutions, whether political or cultural, sneak up on us? According to Quran, it's because we tend to focus on traditional markers of change, legislatures, court rulings and opinion polls, while ignoring deeper cultural shifts. These changes happen almost imperceptibly in what Quran calls the overstory of entertainment and pop culture. Take the example of psychiatrist David Rubin's late 1960s book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex. Its dismissive and ugly portrayal of homosexuality reflected mainstream America's views at the time, describing gay relationships as fleeting and furtive. When gay rights pioneer Evan Wolfson wrote his Harvard law thesis advocating for gay marriage in the early 1980s, his ideas were dismissed as radical, even by sympathetic professors. By the early 2000s, opposition seemed insurmountable. President George W. Bush called for a federal amendment banning same-sex marriage, and the movement hit its lowest point. Yet, beneath the surface, cultural forces were shifting. A 1992 made-for-TV drama, Doing Time on Maple Drive, featured a gay character, though it treated his sexuality as an isolated problem to solve. Media scholar Bonnie Dow observed that gay characters in the 1980s and 1990s followed three unwritten rules. They were never central to the narrative. Their sexuality was always portrayed as a problem, and they rarely had meaningful communities of other gay people. These portrayals, while more tolerant than outright hostility, failed to present gay people as normal participants in relationships. Then came Will and Grace on NBC in 1998. The creators, David Cohan and Max Muchnick, crafted a groundbreaking love story between a straight woman and a gay man. Will, a lawyer, wasn't defined by his sexuality, nor was it treated as a problem to solve. Over its multi-season run, the show broke the old three rules. Will was central, not peripheral. His identity wasn't tragic, and he was surrounded by a diverse group of friends. Initially criticized by some in the gay community for being too mainstream, the show's humor and relatability allowed it to infiltrate millions of American households weekly, subtly shifting cultural norms. Sociologist Damon Centola's name game experiments demonstrate how norms can flip once dissenters reach about 25% of a population. Below this threshold, change feels impossible. Above it, consensus shifts rapidly. Gay marriage followed this trajectory. Activists despaired over repeated losses until, seemingly overnight, entire states began legalizing same-sex marriage. Cultural messaging from years of shows like Will and Grace pushed public consciousness toward that tipping point. By the time politicians recognized the shift, the revolution was nearly complete. This swift transformation underscores how revolutions often unfold in unexpected places. Just as Eastern European dissidents missed the collapse of communism, gay marriage pioneers underestimated the impact of primetime TV in reshaping societal norms. The lesson is clear. Cultural signals are powerful indicators of change. When the overstory, popular culture, refashions public consciousness, it can secure major victories before laws or polls even reflect what's happening. As Quran might argue, revolutions often catch even their architects off guard because they ignore the subtle but transformative influence of culture. Whether through sitcoms like Will and Grace or dramas like Doing Time on Maple Drive, these cultural narratives quietly lay the groundwork for societal change, proving that the biggest revolutions often begin in the most unassuming places. Overstories, superspreaders and group proportions. I'd like to begin by describing that brief but transformative moment after the opium poppy loses its petals. The pod beneath those petals contains a potent sap. Morphine, codeine, heroin and oxycodone all trace their origins to that unassuming yellowish fluid. For centuries, people have tamed and refined these alkaloids. Morphine soothed pain but addicted patients. Codeine promised milder relief. Heroin looked like the safe alternative, yet brought disaster. And finally, oxycodone remained the lesser-known cousin until recently. In 1916, two German chemists reconfigured oxycodone from the bane. That might have been the end of its story had Purdue Pharma not decided, decades later, to recast it as OxyContin. With a high-dose extended-release format and the marketing zeal to match, Purdue launched a painkiller so successful that it became notorious. Along the way, a congressional hearing spotlighted the family that owned Purdue, the Sacklers. Kath Sackler and David Sackler faced questions about their responsibility in the opioid crisis. Kath admitted feeling anger at the employees who broke laws and regret about how events transpired, but she refused to see personal complicity. David ventured a different line, saying he felt deep moral responsibility, because their product has been associated with abuse and addiction. He used passive voice, a rhetorical choice that implied the crisis somehow occurred around him, instead of through direct company actions. This pattern of evasion parallels other examples of denial in social epidemics. In a place called Poplar Grove, parents reacted to teenage suicides by withdrawing deeper into their expectations. In Miami, public officials dismissed the city's epic Medicare fraud as a quirk no different from fraud elsewhere. We saw how public opinion on gay marriage flipped overnight, yet many dismissed the possibility until it had already happened. The truth is, epidemics almost always have clear points of origin, hidden decisions, and specific triggers. That is how OxyContin unleashed devastation. A set of circumstances lined up, targeted marketing flourished, and a seemingly modest drug swept the nation. Opioid overdoses soared in one country above all, the United States. Demographer Jessica Ho's work showed other rich nations rarely matched America's grim numbers. American prescribing practices varied widely from state to state. Alabama's was double California's. Indiana far exceeded Illinois. Economists and sociologists pointed to local overstories, the rules and attitudes that shaped whether doctors reached for opioids or not. And at the root was a man nearly lost to history named Paul E. Madden, who in 1939 introduced triplicate prescription pads in California. Other states eventually followed. As a result, doctors there hesitated to prescribe opioids casually, while non-triplicate states had no such safeguards. That single difference lay dormant for decades, until Purdue noticed how difficult it was to sell OxyContin in a place like Texas or New York. They simply gave up on those states and took their message to easier targets. Enter the second overstory, led by Russell Portnoy, a revered pain specialist who promoted the notion that doctors were too stingy with pain relief. His speeches reassured them that few patients really got addicted, that medicine was part science, part art, and that doctors had to stop fearing lawsuits or censure. Over time, Portnoy's ideas supplanted Paul Madden's. Then came OxyContin's big rollout, skipping the places that followed Madden's system. Once that new wave took off, attention turned to the core group of high-prescribing doctors. Consulting giant McKinsey helped Purdue refine a system that rewarded sales reps for befriending the heaviest prescribers. Most physicians exercised caution, but a few thousand, labeled core or super core, became super spreaders, prescribing thousands of pills in quick succession. That small fraction accelerated the epidemic. Finally, a reformulation of OxyContin made it harder to crush. Some thought that would stifle abuse. Instead, it pushed a sizable group toward heroin and fentanyl, fueling more dangerous addictions. Examining the entire sequence leads to a stark realization. A single set of bureaucratic requirements in a handful of states staved off one of history's worst overdose crises within their borders. Meanwhile, a drug company's sales strategy zeroed in on a tiny fraction of doctors, igniting national upheaval. A small reformulation switch drove countless users towards street drugs. And through it all, the Sacklers maintained they couldn't have done anything differently. Hiding behind has been associated with to dodge accountability. All of these events remind us that epidemics follow rules. They don't erupt mysteriously, and they can be contained if we grasp who's driving them and how. We saw how a few doctors, a few marketing plans, or a few overstory shifts in state policy can mean the difference between stable prescribing and rampant addiction. That leaves us with a clear take-home message. If societies keep pretending they have no power over their own epidemics, we'll only witness more passive voice apologies and more harrowing human cost. Epidemics, as these stories illustrate, hinge on more than fate. Local norms, hidden proportions, powerful media signals, and a tiny number of actors can determine massive contagions, whether social or viral. We see how a single spark can catch, sometimes with dire effects. And when it is over, those responsible may insist it has been associated with them, quietly stepping back from any direct admission. Meanwhile, the rest of us face the vexing challenge. How to harness or hinder these explosive tipping points, how to own our complicity, and how to avoid letting the passive voice mask a crisis caused in truth by conscious human decisions.